messing with the SATs, more drag shows in middle schools, the infamous Equality Act, and Billionaire gives back. Next on The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Every week, Katie and I cover those stories impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the globe. Greetings to our many listeners, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode. Make sure you stick around because later in the show, we'll be discussing more drag queens being invited into schools across the country for anti-bullying purposes. And we sit down with a former college administrator to discuss the high cost of college tuition and the mounting debt current and former students are feeling. That's all coming up right now. First, Katie, a couple of things, and we're going to tease this a little bit later, but we are on the precipice of achieving 100,000 followers. That is 100,000 followers. Thank you. That's a big number. We're very, very excited. And Katie, we've got some emails and queries from home. We mentioned that she is a baby mama to be, a current baby mama, and a baby mama to be for the next 50, 60 years anyway. And so you'll notice that she's not wearing Argyle today. That is because some of you asked me, where is her baby registered? And the dirty little secret about Katie Petrick is that she gets all her clothes from either Goodwill or the St. Vincent de Paul Society. So she never spent, I think, more than $4 for anything that you've seen her wear on the show. So she is very frugal. So if you're looking to find a baby gift for baby Katie's little baby Katie, then what you got to do is hit the rummage sales.
It's pronounced Saint Vincent de Paul.
De Paul.
Saint
Vincent de
and
Paul.
it's $3.99. No more.
Yep, that's the target maximum, right?
And
there.
that is actually the truth.
She is the most frugal millennial I have ever met.
Parsimonious.
Yes, and God help that baby.
Yeah,
right?
please.
Because it would not surprise me if she recycled disposable diapers for this kid.
I may draw the line there.
Draw the line. Speaking
line
of bad lines to draw, our first story this week is a biggie. It's the SAT, right? Those exams your kids are supposed to take to get into college. They are now going to add an adversity score. They couldn't quite legally ask kids their race. They wanted to desperately. So in other words, if your kid was a minority, if your kid was Asian, they'd probably lose points on the SAT. If they were Latino or black, they might gain points, but they couldn't do that. So they did the next best thing. They're adding an adversity score that takes into account the neighborhood you grow up in, the poverty rates in that area. What does any of this have to do with that kind of testing we do for universities? And the problem with this is that, and this is I think I was the first one, I believe we were the first ones to break this, because the mainstream media and the major news networks didn't quite make the connection until I think we suggested it, that the guy in charge of the SATs, the college boards, is David Coleman, our old friend David Coleman of Common Core. He was the architect of the Common Core state standards. He, without any educational background in his own history, right? He's never taught a class, he's never been a teacher, he's never been an education major. He was put in charge of the Common Core standards for your kids, which tells you something. If you put a non-education person in charge of constructing the standards for the entire country's educational system, you're not going to get a real educational set of standards. You're going to get a sociological one, which is what you've got. No sooner did Common Core come and go than David Coleman left the Common Core with no educational background, and he became the chairman or the CEO of the college boards, in charge of the SAT. And now the SAT not only is beginning to reflect Common Core bias, it is now going to give your kids entry-level scores to college based on a lot of things that have nothing at all to do with education.
And there are a total of 15 factors that they're actually looking at, and you tease some of them, including the crime rate in a student's neighborhood, what the rigor of the student's high school curriculum is, which is a joke at this point, because rigor in students'
it's all
high
Common
school
Core.
curriculum.
I can answer that one for you, David. There's no rigor in anything you put together, so just give everybody a flat 0 on that one.
It also looks at the estimated education level of your parents, of the student's parents, but of course, as you said, they can't include race. They cannot.
Well, they're doing it.
They're doing it.
All
they're
of this.
Circumventing it. Yeah.
And don't you love, Katie, how liberals, when it comes to this kind of stuff, they can't use race, so they're going to do a whole bunch of stereotypical things. If you live in a bad neighborhood
clearly, yeah.
or there's a lot of gun violence, you must be black, right? The assumptions that liberals make, the racist assumptions that liberals make when they try to help liberals are truly staggering.
And your good friend there, David Coleman, he actually told the Wall Street Journal, there are a number of amazing students who may have scored less on the SAT, but have accomplished more. We can't sit on our hands and ignore the disparities of wealth reflected in the SAT.
They have scored poorly, but accomplished more. I wish I could use that in my life. You know, I couldn't pass my driving test, but I've accomplished so much in my basket weaving class. You know, I didn't accomplish much when I went through my gun training, but I should be allowed to be a cop, right? In fact, the fact that I can't handle a gun means that the diversity of the police force requires me to be added to your roles. And so what David Coleman is basically telling you is educrat speak for we don't really care what your kids are qualified to do. If they can't do things and they're minorities, we're going to pretend like they are as qualified as everybody else in the name of social justice. Is that how that works? This is basically affirmative action for college.
And if it doesn't make you upset enough that they're doing this little adversity score, know, too, that you cannot even look at the score.
Yep.
So you get your SAT results. How did I score on verbal? How did I score on math? Adversity, you have no idea. This is all behind
Hidden.
the scenes. And so you can't, as students, see the numbers. Your admissions officers, who I know, those people are so well trained, they're going to look at these numbers, and they have full discretion into whether or not you get into college.
That's right. And so you'll never know. Your kid could be a 4.0 student. Your kid can be an first generation Asian American living in a gun violent part of Chicago and score a perfect score on the SATs and not get in because, well, Asians aren't diverse enough.
And if you don't like just like hearing the words of David Coleman, listen to his actual voice, because he went on CNN. Listen to what he said.
An SAT score only shows so much. But when you put it together with the context in which someone has emerged, you can identify, you have a more chance to see students who have scored remarkably well in very demanding circumstances.
It's like somebody gave Milhouse a job at the Department of Education from The Simpsons. It's unbelievable when you think about it. Do you hear the educational bull? Did you hear it? These kids who didn't score remarkably high did score remarkably high given the fact that they were being shot at all the time, which you have no evidence of because you're basing it on zip codes now, right? And Centers for Disease Control reports. This is what you're basing it on now. You literally can't discriminate on skin color the way you want to. So you're going to use all sorts of stereotypical markers to discriminate anyway.
And since he's such a genius, he goes on to say, what's cool is the application that you care about remains intact. Well, why can't that just be it? Why is this? We have to put this adversity score. And they've been, piloting this for about a year or two now. And more than 50 schools at this point, including Yale, have done some beta testing on it. And of these schools, they seem to, enjoy it. But wait, aren't they also the ones in trouble for doing certain things?
I thought you were going to work beta and David Coleman in the same sentence, which would have been
Well,
totally
that's
appropriate, right?
That would be repetition.
Would be
right?
it would be a tautology,
It'd be a
right?
tautology.
And so I guess I go back to my point here. If you want to get more kids into universities who don't really qualify, then say so. Then have universities flat out and say, we're going to set aside this many students for kids who aren't college ready. We're not going to pretend they are. We're not going to pretend that they've achieved so much in bottle collecting or marbles. They've achieved so much in what? Mowing grasses for people, or they've achieved so much in playing sports, or they have wonderful stories to tell. This is not that kind of test, guys. Right? There are all sorts of ways you measure athletes when you want to accept them to college, right? They're called scholarships, right? A kid who's maybe not completely prepared for college, but is a very remarkable athlete, that's a legitimate reason to take that kid. Why are we pretending here that the SATs now are still a actual useful measure of intellectual achievement? They are not. Just get rid of them. Be honest with what you're doing to us, right? Say, look, we're going to set aside this many students. Because if you do that, if you are honest that you're discriminating against certain kids over others, you'll get your asses sued. So you're doing everything but admitting it, and somehow you get away with this.
And that's the thing. I mean, the Supreme Court has kind of wavered, and they said, in terms of whether or not you're allowed to use quotas, which at this point is kind of what's happening here, to create this kind of diversity within a student body. They have even said, the Supreme Court has basically cautioned schools saying, don't make this kind of reported application data out there and as a deciding factor, or whether or not you're going to admit, student A, B, or C. Like, if the Supreme Court's getting involved, it'll be interesting to see what happens once this goes into play.
One of the reasons they're doing this is because they know the Supreme Court's in a tenuous place for them, right?
Yeah.
That a serious look at these kinds of racial quotas for colleges, and what's getting them is the Asian lawsuit, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
A lot of Asian groups have banded together to sue places like Harvard for discriminating against high-achieving Asians, right? Back when it was white and primarily Jewish kids that were knocking it through the roof, no one gave a rat's ass about those kids, right? But Asian kids now are an actual progressive minority group. And when groups of them are suing because they're being discriminated against, that's when David Coleman, super nerd, goes into action, right? He strips off his bow tie, right? He hops into a phone booth, I'm not exactly sure with whom, and pops out in his skinnies and his underoos to fix the problem by embedding racial quotas without talking about race. Well done, America. And keep in mind that the College Board is a private organization that has no representation by you and me. They're not a government organization. They're just a private company that makes a lot of money off you and your kids. And a lot of our federal tax dollars goes to them to support this. And we have no say over them as public citizens. The government just contracts with them to do this, and you don't have any choice. It's what we call a racket.
More depressing. Here's the Equality Act, because we have the Democrats on Friday in the House of Representatives voting 236 to 173, with 23 people not voting, in favor of H.R. 5. It's better known as the Equality Act. And it would require schools to include male athletes who identify as transgender girls on female sports teams. Now, this is just past the House, and we know the House is Democrat-led, and all of the Democrats voted for it, and all but one of them actually sponsored the bill to begin with. So it would have to go to the Senate and would have to pass there, and then it would have to go to Trump, and Trump would veto it if it for some reason passed. So don't get too worked up about it, but it's something to note. Republican Florida Rep Greg Steube actually introduced a last-minute amendment to at least try and make it so they would preserve Title IX's protections of female athletic teams, but of course the Democrats rejected it. So even the effort that was at least sort of put forth failed.
Yeah, I would, not to contradict you, I would get very worked up about this because it passed the House almost unanimously with the Democrats, and 8 idiotic Republicans voted for it, which isn't a large number, but here's the problem. The Senate may or may not pass it. I mean, the majority of the Republicans have in the Senate is not that big. All it's going to take is a handful of John McCain types to get this through. And I'm not 100% Donald Trump would veto it simply because Betsy DeVos, remember the Kushners, when one of the things that Trump wanted to do his first couple weeks in office, was push back against the Title IX transgender stuff. And he was talked out of it, Donald Trump, by his relatives who are also his employees. And so I'm not 100% convinced of this, that this is going to die.
And I'm a little bit more optimistic about it because, Senate Majority Leader is Cocaine Mitch, and he's called himself the Grim Reaper. And now that the Republicans don't have control of both houses, and now it's, a little bit more tenuous, he's taken it upon himself to, obviously now the Republicans can come to power and be the saviors of everything. So I don't know that he's actually going to call the vote with this. I mean, Chuck Schumer has already, been begging him, and we'll see what happens with it. But I don't know that it'll actually make it. I don't think it will, and I guess I'm optimistic and hopeful that it won't.
But my pessimism is not just about this particular round. I think the odds are 75-25 that it's killed in the Senate if a vote happens, and I think it's probably 90% likely that it gets killed at Trump's desk. I would say, however, this is going to keep coming back every year. It's going to come back again and again. And the next time you have a Democrat president, mark my words, that there will be enough Republicans in the Senate, even if they have a majority, to push this through. And that's why you should be very concerned about this. And the fact that they call this the Equality Act, nobody knows what that means. Because how could you possibly be against equality? Notice that they never name these bills what they are. It is a bill that, in the minds of progressives, equalizes men who think they're women and women. It allows males and boys into girls' showers and locker rooms. It forces schools, it could potentially force every school and every girl's sport in the country in the public schools to mandatorily take boys who identify as girls. It completely destroys the right of local and state control over this. If this passes, federal judges could order comprehensive sex ed in every public school. They could require you as young as pre-K to start teaching kids transgender issues, and local moms and dads and states will not be able to override this federal initiative. In other words, we've been saying for 10 years now that once this got federal, the feds were going to take every opportunity to push this. Now that the legislature, the Congress, the Senate, now that they have laws in place, the ESSA Act, right, passed by Republicans, that gives a legal legal basis for federal intervention into state schools. Democrats are already on this, right? Let's start doing it. Let's force this agenda into your kids' schools. This is a great, big deal. It is one of the things we warned you about that would come as a consequence of Common Core. And one thing that No Child Left Behind, Common Core goals 2000 under Clinton, what these did is they set the framework where the feds now get a final say, a major say. And you can already see how radically liberal politicians and ignorant Republicans are beginning to support this kind of federal intervention into your state schools.
Well, and it's going to be 100% guarantee that they are going to keep coming back with this.
Oh, yeah.
You are absolutely correct. The thing I want to note for people, just to give them actual language from the bill so they understand what we're saying. In the summary of the bill, it says this bill prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in areas including public accommodations and facilities, education, federal funding, employment, housing, credit, and the jury system. Specifically, the bill defines and includes sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity among the prohibited categories of discrimination or segregation. And what's going to happen here is now that they put this out all in one package, and that's why it's probably going to fail, they're going to do piece by piece and try and sneak it here and there. I guarantee, I would put my money on the next omnibus. This language
Some of it will be there.
So look for the next omnibus, and that's going to be the real teller.
Land-breaking 1964 civil rights legislation that gave rise to this is going to be amended. What they're doing is they're amending that pioneering legislation to deal with racial segregation, and now something as opaque and ill-defined as gender disorientation, or people who are gender confused, or people who identify as transgender, or 176 different genders for that matter. Something as vaguely defined and as recently brought forth as this is going to have the same types of protections, which means, again, at the federal level, once this passes, it's not even a matter of your schools trying to fight it. By law, the schools have to accommodate it, which means you, mom and dad, have even less say than you have now.
Just a quick reminder that our show grows because of all of you out there listening and watching us. So please continue to spread the word on The Dr. Duke Show by liking, commenting, and sharing each and every episode on whatever platform you prefer, whether that's Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. And don't forget the audio podcast makes for a great listen wherever you may be. We're on iTunes and everywhere else. So please subscribe. Give us that 5-star review so we can continue to move up in the rankings. Now, we're going to middle school, and we're going to go to Durham, North Carolina at Central Park School for Children, where they just recently welcomed some drag queens to the middle school for a 2-hour celebration of LGBT and how people are different. 2 teachers, Taylor Schmidt and Shara, or maybe it's pronounced Sarah, but it has a C, so Shara Brooks, they're both members of LGBT, and they thought that the LGBT kids they noticed in school back in the fall were being bullied. So they organized an event, and of course it was approved right away, and they called it the Pride and Liberation event. Schmidt said, if we're going to be a school that's focused on equity and justice, and if we're going to be a school that believes in the act of liberation, we need to be creative with our approach. So, here's what they did. They invited Vivica C. Cox and Stormy Day of the House of Cox, drag house.
And for the record, that's COXX, in case you missed the obvious double entendre there.
The House of Cox, drag house, to speak at the school, and they also had this panel that had one of the city council members. So you had Cox, city council member, and Day. And then the event had a drag show and another little show from the school's step team. And according to News and Record, they reported, in between Beyonce and Nicki Minaj songs, Cox and Day connected with the students over growing up in Durham and what it was like to feel different, slipping in quick lessons about LGBT history along the way. For one song, Day swirled a floor-length skirt, each layer of fabric a different color of the rainbow. Cheers erupted when she pulled the skirt off to reveal a gold jumpsuit and knee-high gold boots.
Yeah, you know what? Notice what these 2 teachers did. So you're a mom and dad, you send your kid to public school. These 2 lesbian gay activists, are they gay themselves, do we know? We don't know that.
Yeah, Taylor is, and it said that Shara was.
So 2 gay
LGBT,
teachers who are gay activists decided all of a sudden that lesbian and gay kids were being bullied. Not a single shred of evidence. If kids are being bullied in the school, shouldn't that go to the principal? Should it go to the superintendent? Shouldn't something be done institutionally to stop the bullying? No. Because you know what? There really wasn't any bullying. But they saw bullying, which they didn't report, and did not become a public issue. What they did instead is because they saw bullying, or in other words, we need a reason to bring these drag queens in. We saw bullying. We, of our own initiative, decided we were going to bring these drag queens in. We're going to take away from your kids' class time. Now, kids could opt out if they wanted to.
Oh, of course they could, but...
Could, right? But we're going to put this, and you're a kid. You're going to sit there and do math homework?
Middle school
Middle
kid.
schoolers. You're a sixth grader, and you got a chance to go off to your science lab, or you sit there and watch the drag show.
In Beyonce.
In Beyonce, right? Nicki Minaj shaking her junk. Does she have
Don't-
junk? Is she anyway,
You know what? We don't know.
Does Cox has junk, right?
Well,
Both Coxes, Coxeye,
Coxeye.
the two drag queens that were brought in here. And please explain this to me. If you honestly think the kids are being bullied, how are two gay men dressed as women going to convey that to 6-year-old minds, 7-year-old 6th grade minds or 7th grade minds? How's that going to do that? Why didn't you bring in an actual gay person without the clothes on? Right? And explain, here, I'm a homosexual. I look a lot like you. I dress a lot like you. Here's the problem I have. Why drag queens, for God's sake? I'll tell you why. Sorry, cut you off. I don't want your answer right now. I want to tell. That was completely rhetorical, Patrick. I'm going to tell you why, right? And the reason why is this. If I can remember my train of thought. Because the drag queen in the gauzy clothes who rips off her multicolored skirts and shows the gold jumpsuit, that's designed to appeal to 7th grade, 6th grade sensibilities. It's kitschy, it's fun, right? This is a way of not countering bullying. This is a way of teaching. And they sprinkled in LGBTQ history lessons. Mom and Dad, you're at home, right? This is what they're doing on your kids' time. And again, I guess you could have opted the kids out.
Yeah, but again, most of them, it said most of them decided to attend.
Of course
Because
they
again, they're in junior high.
It's
why school, work, watching a show and colors and songs.
When
and fun.
I was in middle school, I'm sure it's true for you, any excuse to not sit through class. You could have had a goat chewing tin cans on stage for 45 minutes.
And the thing is, it's very telling because Cox said, Central Park didn't water it down, but they made it age appropriate to give it a depth to social justice and activism, which is the core of the queer experience. So Cox is even saying, we accomplished what we wanted to have happen.
And look, the teachers themselves said this, right? This is what your public school teachers are defining as what they're supposed to do to your kids. That these are, if we're going to be a school that's focused on equity and justice, is that the purpose of our public schools, number one? If we're going to be a school that's focused on equity and justice according to progressive sensibilities, and that we believe in acts of liberation. These are freaking public school teachers with a 4-year degree from some middle-of-the-road Department of Education on a college campus. They are not sociologists. They are not sex therapists. They are not psychiatrists. They are elementary and middle school teachers who are taking it upon themselves to transform your 7th graders' classes into sites of equity, justice, and liberation, and you're paying for it.
And you're also paying for it in Pennsylvania, where a Pennsylvania high school hosted a drag show during school hours. And whereas the other story was, 2 hours long, this one, pretty much all day. The College Fix alerted basically the public to a story at Penwood High School in Landon, Pennsylvania. The school's Gay Straight Alliance hosted, it was an almost all-day event, and it was called Coming Home, a place for everyone to feel safe. The morning session included being an ally, navigating the world, college and beyond, and LGBTQ plus health issues. So that's the 3 lessons they got in the morning. And in the afternoon, it was when they got the drag show, essentially, singing and runway performances, followed with a video on the history of the 1969 Stonewall riots and history of drag. So according to a source at College Fix, in this community area, there's actually about 15 to 20% Muslim population. And because of this type of what's happening in this school, and it has been happening, most of them have pulled their kids out of this high school and are sending them to parochial Christian schools, but they still have to pay taxes. So it's really interesting to see what's happening in this community.
And look, do you see what you're getting here in Pennsylvania? It's all day. It's the same liberation equity mindset. And this particular school, it blows me away. I bet you not 1 in 25 of those high school kids can tell you anything meaningful about the Constitution. I'll bet you the vast majority of those high school kids know almost nothing about the history of our founding. And yet, they're getting treated to, in these days, the history of drag. These are kids who can tell you nothing meaningful about Thomas Jefferson, other than he was a racist, who don't know the first thing about the colonial period, who don't know any of the rights and responsibilities that come with freedom in the Constitution. But what do they know? They learn the history of drag. So these kids now can tell you about how drag queens evolved throughout history, but they can tell you almost nothing else meaningless about American history. And you wonder why these kids are going to college, Mom and Dad, and chasing conservative speakers off with bricks and holding administrators hostage to completely transform the curriculum. That's why this is happening.
At the same school, there is a Christian group, because this was put on by the Gay Straight Alliance, and it was actually sponsored by the school nurse, Tracy Boyle. But so the Gay Straight Alliance is the one who sponsored this. There is a Christian group, but they only meet after school hours because
they're not allowed, right?
Yeah, so the fact that this is happening, there are 180 school days, right? And the fact that they're taking pretty much an entire day, it was from like 10 a.m., I think, all the way to basically school ended, an entire day to go through this, that's one more day of them having no understanding of the Constitution.
But they know about the history of drag.
Oh, that is history
and
class
by the
now.
way, we see 2 teachers in the middle school in North Carolina who just decide to do this in response to some unnamed and unreported bullying incidents that they made up. And you got the nurse doing it here, right? The student nurse sponsors, the school nurse sponsors this.
Now,
when I went to school, by the way, the idea that a school nurse could hijack a day's worth of classes is astounding.
I'm pretty sure that David Coleman's analysis of the rigor of these schools, this is
one of those astonishing kids are doing in schools besides actually achieving academic success. When David Coleman says to you, right, for his SAT gerrymandering, that we've got so many kids who've accomplished wonderful things even if they don't score well on tests, this is it. Well, we spent the whole day listening to drag queens. That, to David Coleman, is a reason why you should get in college over some poor Asian kid with a perfect score on the SATs.
Yep, and then when you get into college, you can make sure that your tuition dollars are going towards more diversity. We found out that Iowa University, the University of Iowa, Corn State, is going to be spending this fiscal year more than $2.7 million just for their Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And this budget spans nearly 70 different activities and spending categories. Now, according to the division's goal, listen how many times the word equity shows up. The division's goal is excellence through diversity, equity, and inclusion by providing leadership and resources to advance UI's diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, coordinating central diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, advancing recruitment and retention of faculty, students, and staff, enhancing a welcoming, respectful, and inclusive climate for all, and connecting with community, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
Yep. Keep saying it. It's a mantra. Equity, diversity, inclusion. Equity, diversity, inclusion. It is a Svengali-like wheel spinning. Don't ask what any of those things mean. Don't point out how hypocritical most of those things are, because each one of them discriminates against people to include them, right? To include other people. All of which, if you have any values or worldview or traditional associations of things that completely challenge this, you're on the outs. They have to exclude you to have their kinds of inclusion, right? So it's just utterly just repeat. Wash, lather, rinse, repeat again and again and again until it seeps into your skull and you don't even have to think about what the words mean anymore.
And what makes you want to throw up even more is there was probably a little panel of people who came up with all those words, put them into order, and those are the same people that make up the $1.95 million, which goes to the salaries for the staff and the personnel.
$2 million out of this $3 million to pay for more and more diversity, inclusion, and equity officers. And guess what? Every time you hire 5 new diversity, inclusion, and equity officers, those 5 have to justify their job. So they crack down on more and more people who they consider aren't equitous, inclusive, and diverse, right? And so they hire then 10 more to prove how, see, we just had 5 more find all these other situations, so we give us another $2 million, we'll hire 10, 20 more, right? Until you're at the point now where the only thing that goes on in college campuses is evidently the only things going on in our public schools, drag shows and equity meetings and black dorms for black students and Native American graduations for Native American graduations and nobody else and shower rooms that are multi-gender and it goes on and on.
It does. A couple of the things that I looked at when I looked at the budget breakdown that, I mean, it's not a lot of money, but $1,000 on the Cup o' Justice.
Cup o' Justice.
Is that coffee? Is it racist coffee. There's a lot of things you could look at. But anyway.
Maybe it's athletic supporters.
There you go.
Athletic supporters for equity. Cup o' justice.
Cup of justice. And then the $5,000 they're spending on faculty of color receptions and activities.
So lots of catered food to stand around and talk about equity, inclusion, and diversity by people who are already committed to equity, inclusion, and diversity.
Yeah. And then it makes you wonder why on a lot of colleges we have women and African Americans who are favoring inclusivity over free speech. We had a recent survey just came out by the College Pulse. It's supported by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and it found that women, blacks, and members of minority religions favor inclusivity by a wide margin. And so the question was, you were asked, do you believe in promoting inclusivity society versus protecting citizens' free speech? Which one's more important to you? And free speech won out on 4 different groups, and then inclusivity won out on another 4. So those who actually favored free speech tend to be Mormons, white evangelical Protestants, white mainline Protestants, and Catholics. Mm-hmm. Those who tended to believe inclusivity is more important than free speech are Jewish, non-Christian religion, which are going to be your Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhism, and then unaffiliated and non-white Protestants.
Yeah, so in other words, what we see here going on is the artificiality of inclusion. 17 different times on this show I've pointed this out. We've moved from a culture now that's about diversity. That for 10 years that was the mania. Now the mania is inclusion. And inclusion is a much more frightening concept than diversity. Diversity means, it should mean we all look alike and think alike. We all look differently and think differently. But what it means, diversity on a college campus means everybody looks different but thinks the same way. That's bad enough. Now you've got a situation where inclusion. And the only people you can include are people who consider themselves excluded. And that's already been defined for us for the next 1,000 years. If you are white, if you are conservative, you are male, you are heterosexual, you are heteronormative, as they would say, if you're that, then for the next 1,000 years, you have to be excluded in the name of including everybody else. So it is not inclusion, it's exclusion. And what it's done is you convince these people that inclusion carries there's nothing in the Constitution about inclusion. There's nothing in our laws. Inclusion, it doesn't mean anything. If we let you, given that all these people are already on campus, and many, if not all of them, are getting financial aid to be there, they're included, but that's not enough. It's not genuine inclusion until you silence somebody else, which is why they're after they would rather have inclusion, which allows them to be perpetual victims with the power to shut you down, right, with your free speech. That's how this system works.
And since you bring up the Constitution, obviously they don't understand what's in the Constitution, or the First Amendment, which includes free speech, because they were asked, should hate speech be protected by the First Amendment? And they broke it down in a couple different ways, but it was actually heterosexuals. 64% of heterosexuals said yes, it should be. And of course, 61% of those, they say gay and lesbian, said no. So there's that exact contrast.
There you go.
Yeah.
In other words, inclusion means to be a minority, you can say whatever you want. If you're a part of the majority, you shouldn't, right? So that's as simple as this goes. The gay culture on campus has figured out that they have a huge stick with which to beat everybody. Even if there's not a shred of evidence behind it, you can get investigated for it. And yet, however, you don't want to extend the same free speech rights to traditional minority groups because then it's an equal footing. You don't want equality. You want the ability to punish people who don't say what you want them to say.
Because it's free for me, but not for thee.
And don't use the word thee, you Christian bigot. It's a hallmark of the King James Version Bible. You just microaggressed me.
They actually they asked this question. I like how they broke it down. How do people, in terms of offensive language, do people need to be more careful about the language they use, or are people too easily offended these days? Mm-hmm. Those who feel that you need to be more careful with your language, those who are non-binary, 74% of them, 3 out of 4 said, you need to be more careful about the language you use. I'm looking right at you when I say that.
Those who say that you have to mind your language are the ones who are saying really hateful things if you don't. right? The ones that are saying mind your language are the ones who use phrases like toxic masculinity, branding an entire gender. They're the ones who say white privilege, right? Your skin color determines who you are. They're the ones saying that, conveniently, the ones saying that minorities can't be racist are primarily minorities, right? So I can say racist things about you, but it doesn't count. And you, something small and trivial like asking, oh, I like your hair today, could be a microaggression against me on the basis of my race.
Well, earlier today, Dr. Duke sat down with Sandy Duckett, a former college administrator, to talk about the high cost of attending college and what, if anything, can be done to change it.
Yes, it's my great pleasure to introduce Sandra Duckett. Sandy is a former administrator at a college.
Yes.
And you have a lot of experience with educational issues. And you are also one of the foremost authorities on the dangers and consequences of our kids' student loan debt.
Well, I would say I have been trying to bring awareness to especially young people and their parents about the educational system and what these student loans do to them in the future. It really hinders their ability to get ahead, and there's a lot of research out there right now that validates that statement.
Let's start with the problem. For those who don't know, and it's been in the news a lot, what is our kids' student loan debt? How serious is this? And how did they get into this mess?
Well, I would say we have to roll this back until at 2010. In 2010, the federal government took over student loans, and they rolled it into the health care bill. And what's very interesting about that, during that period of time, banks, community banks and financial institutions actually were advisors on how to lend money to these students so that they didn't get over their heads. The idea that the federal government took these over in 2010 took that extra check and balance away. So money became very free for individuals and students to access. In 2014 then, and I really think this was implemented because the health care bill was starting to falter. Interest rates on student loans went from 3.4% to 6.8%, doubling those interest rates. Now, if your viewers could just think about their own mortgage, home mortgage, what would they have done if their interest rates on their home mortgage doubled? And that's what happened. And we're starting to see that cycle from 2014 when they doubled those interest rates, that the default rate also increased. We're seeing less people buy homes. We're seeing less people getting married. We're seeing less people having children, and that's all impacting that generation. In addition, it's also impacting seniors who want to retire, because in 2007 and 2008, many people went back to college because of the economic downturn, and they would like to retire, but because they still have those loans, it now comes out of their Social Security, so they can't retire. They have to continue to work.
Well, let's be clear, too. In 2010, when the federal government under Barack Obama took over the student loans and kind of froze the banks out,
yes,
they did that because their idea of lending to kids was not based on education or even qualification. It was based on social justice issues, right? That we're going to give kids, no matter what they want to study, no matter how unprofitable their majors might be, in the name of social justice, we're going to keep giving more and more money without any restrictions. And that got a lot of kids into school in feel-good ways who were never going to pass school. So you got kids who took 2 and 3 years of college before they failed out. They still have all the loans, and they don't have a degree to show for it.
Absolutely. And 68% of young people change their minds at least once, if not multiple times. So
About what they're going to major in.
Correct.
Yeah.
So if you start in one program, those credits in most cases don't transfer to another credit. These loans, I think the biggest thing that we can do to start providing some relief is to roll back that bill that was passed in 2014. Roll back those interest rates, because what is happening is they also added different kinds of loans and extended that payment period. So people are now going from 10 years to 20 years to pay off their student loans, accumulating more interest on these loans and hindering their ability to get ahead and to save for their future.
Well, what responsibility? One of the things we see is that a lot of kids now are demanding that they be waived. and that they're gravitating to politicians like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who, if they become president, will waive this debt. What percentage of responsibility do we actually place on these kids for taking loans and taking loans in numbers that they could not pay back based on what they're majoring in?
Duke, what I've been seeing, at least from the individuals that I have talked to, most of them don't want to see the loans waived. They want a ways and means on how to pay them off. And yes, I think there are some people who are demanding, to waive those loans completely, but that's not realistic. And maybe those are some of the young people that shouldn't have gone to college in the first place. But most of the individuals that I have talked to, they just want a ways and means on how to pay these off, but they can't because they talk about deferment. So if you have an unsubsidized loan, and most middle class people have an unsubsidized loan because they don't get the extra attention, that interest is added to the principal. So you may have borrowed $25,000, and I'll give you an example. I had a relative, they borrowed $25,000 on a student loan, a Parents Plus loan. And they paid off $5,000, but they owe $28,000. So that's not allowing people to get ahead. They should start seeing a way to see those loans go down, because you shouldn't pay off a loan forever, especially for education.
Yeah, and we talked about the potential student responsibility. There is still a core sense in which these kids are adults, they know what they're doing, and yet they're being manipulated. They're being actually cheated in some ways. So why is it flipping it on the other side? So with all this talk about fixing this problem, why won't the federal government, it's federal money, it's our taxpayer money, they spend it recklessly in every other way. Look at how they're handling our Social Security so-called treasury. And yet, why can't they just waive altogether the interest on the loans for these kids? If the federal government decides, as they did in 2010 to 14, anybody should go to college for any reason, for however long they want to be there, why not just waive the interest altogether?
Well, and I think that's some of the questions that people have. I've talked with many of our legislators about at least rolling back the interest rates, and what I've been told is they can't afford to do it. They can't afford to do it. Well, my challenge to them is, when we rolled back interest rates on home mortgages, what happened? The housing market tended to pick up. Just when we rolled back the tax rate on individuals, the economy picked up. Can you imagine if we rolled back these interest rates on student loans? How many more people would be able to get ahead? How many people 40% of young people would like to get married, but they aren't because of student loans? I was sitting in a dentist's chair talking with my dentist, and he said, "Sandy, you should be a consultant." And I said, well, sometimes that has a negative word for that. And when he walked out of the room, the dental assistant said to me, "I wish I would have talked to you before I got started." I said, "Do you have student loans?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "How much do you have?" She said, $27,000. This is a dental hygienist who probably started down a different route and then came back to find something that she really liked. And she said to me, I'm engaged, but I don't want to get married until I have this paid off." So how many other people are in that boat? They don't want to start their life with somebody being a burden to them. And I always say, isn't it amazing that 44 million people struggle with student loans, and we have 44 million people who struggle with mental illness? Because when you create anxiety, it leads to depression. And when people feel like they're drowning and they can't get ahead, that's what happens.
So basically we have a situation, if I understand you correctly, where states and the federal government are living off the exorbitant interest rates they're charging kids, that their own political agendas, their inability to be fiscally responsible, we're baiting these kids to take the loans.
Yes.
And then we are profiteering from them.
Yes.
And the same politicians who are doing this are pointing the finger at almost everybody else. They're blaming banks.
Yes.
All right? They're so it is amazing.
It is amazing, because banks actually laid off a lot of their workforce when the government took over these loans, because it was a service entity for their business, and they provided these loans at good interest rates, and they also talked with these young people about what that means. I've talked with legislators who said, let's give them an amortization schedule. Well, every quarter, every semester, they have to add on more debt. because they have more classes and courses they're taking. So when you purchase a home loan, you get one amortization schedule. They may end up with, there's two full semesters each year. So they could end up with 10 amortization schedules because they don't all roll. They become new loans. They don't roll up.
My last question for you, because this is, I'm a 25-year academic. It seems to me that having blamed everybody else, that perhaps the single most amount of blame belongs with our universities. They are selling these kids false promises. The universities they know that if they take these loans, that they're guaranteed loans, that
Yes.
if the kids default, they still get their money. What if we had a system where every university who took a kid that took student loans was on the hook for half those loans if those kids couldn't pay them back in 10 years? That would really make universities rethink their admission policies.
Oh, absolutely. And, we talk about the labor shortage. And I always, when I talked with young people, I bring awareness to what that means. They said there's a shortage in healthcare right now. We need more nurses. Not necessarily. They need more nurses on the weekends, evenings, and holidays. And we let young people know that that's where you'll start. It doesn't mean you'll stay there the rest of your life. And that was another thing from the research that I've reviewed and have been involved in, that many people would like to change. They started down a career path but would like to change a job, but they can't afford to because they have to pay off these loans.
I want to give you the last word. In one sentence or two, either give us or restate what you think the immediately best solution to this would be.
The best solution is to roll back these interest rates to what they were in 2014.
And they were?
3.4%.
And now we're at 6.8.
Yes.
Excellent. Sandra Duckett, thank you so much for being here. We're going to have you back down again soon. This is a really important issue, and I know, talking to you before the show, that there are all sorts of tentacles that we haven't got to yet
Oh,
about
absolutely.
how this works.
This is just a huge animal, and I think I don't know why people are afraid. Educators, really good educators, want to fix this too. And we haven't talked about managed growth. We haven't talked about different kinds of markets, competitive and compatible and complementary markets. And when education becomes competitive, everybody loses.
All right, so hopefully there's hope for our college students and their debts. But we have a story about a billionaire. What's that story?
Did you say hopefully there's hope?
Yes,
Truthfully, there's truth.
that's what I like saying.
Our final story of the day is Billionaire pledges to pay off $40 million in student loan debt for Morehouse College class of 2019. And this is a wonderful story. You have an African-American speaking at an primarily African-American college who does the anti-Michael Scott thing. You may remember in The Office, Michael Scott promised Scott's tots when they were in elementary school that when they graduated from high school, he would pay for all their college tuition. And of course, when they graduate from high school, he's still the broke loser he always was. And so Scott's tots are disappointed. Here is the reverse Scott's tots.
This is my class, 2019. And my family is making a grant to eliminate their student loans.
One of his big promises was he was going to use his money to pay off all those senior debts. And that's a wonderful thing. I would simply raise the question, if this was a white academic, a white commencement speaker doing this for a group of white students, how quickly do you think the charge of racist SOB would be leveled at this poor guy?
See, now you took my thunder because, of course, you've put that cynicism into me now. And I thought the exact same thing because he was speaking to nearly 400 African-American men. And their debt is almost the $40 million, like you said. And the fact that he came out, his name is Robert F. Smith. He should get some credit here. The fact that he came out and said, this is my class of 2019, and I'm going to do this for you. If it was reversed, if it was a white male at an all Christian campus college, the calls for intolerance would be just
it's a primarily male school,
It's
too.
all
Can
male,
you imagine
yeah.
if there was an all-white
men.
boys' school? Those things don't exist anymore, dudes, right? Can you imagine if we had, instead of an all primarily black male school, which is perfectly encouraged, an all-male white school, and all those white boys were given scholarships or having their bills paid off because of that? Still a wonderful story, though, and I don't mean to cast too much cynicism on it. It's a great story, and it's one of the things we keep hearing from Hollywood, right? Hey, Hollywood, Some of you idiots are making $40 million a picture, Brie Larson, with all of your wokeness. Hey, Robert De Niro, as you're dropping F-bombs about the president. Maybe we could get some of you big talkers out there. Why don't you do that? Why don't you pick one graduating class, USC, make it UCLA, right, where you got your drama degrees. Why don't one of you, for once, instead of spending your money on stupid stuff like another yacht or another private jet, why don't you take the revenue of one movie, $40 million, for you big A-listers, and pay off the entire debt for one of these senior graduating classes?
Well, Lori Loughlin tried to do something kind of similar to that, but it didn't really work.
Aunt Becky was not doing something similar. She was spending a lot of money on one girl, hers, who wasn't even qualified, apparently is not even qualified for high school.
Exactly.
So there's a bit of a difference there,
okay.
just a little wee bit.
Just want to clarify that, okay. But I did want to give a shout out too. Smith is the founder of private equity and venture capital firm Vista Equity Partners. He's actually worth about $5 billion, according to Forbes. And
Wait a second. Black people can't get rich in this culture.
Well, he's the richest of them.
This is something wrong here.
I know.
Someone lied to me. There are opportunities. You mean in a capitalist free market country, an African American who clearly has been discriminated against all his life and a male to boot, that guy made $5 billion?
What's his adversity score? That's the question.
I bet you he would score worse than you and I. You and I would have a lesser adversity score than this guy would if he applied to David Coleman's ACT.
Welcome to Extra Credit, this week sponsored by some positive news. But before the good, we must have the dumb. Blackbirds are the latest victims in the racist and offensive category, triggering college students, or in this case, administration. Long Island University, Brooklyn, after 84 years, will no longer be known as the Blackbirds. There was no vote by alumni who asked for one, and instead, according to President Kimberly Klein, the university will just wipe the slate clean when they merge with one of their other campuses. Rumor has it, bubble wrap is in contention for the next mascot.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take this racist bird and break its neck.
More offense has been taken at Pepperdine University in California, which 2 years ago decided to take down a statue of Christopher Columbus. The president at the time called the monument a painful reminder of the past. But fear not, because just up the road, Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula welcomed Columbus with open arms because they are not afraid of history. Of course, Pepperdine said its university remains committed to nurturing a campus community that welcomes a variety of perspectives and the free exchange of ideas, unless your name is Christopher Columbus.
Right, or you're an Italian, or you believe in Renaissance history, or you think actually discovering America for the Europeans means something. Other than that, they're very nurturing at Pepperdine.
On to positive news, because quite frankly, I'm just sick of the insanity. A Christian apologetics group at the University of Colorado Springs can now pick its group leaders. All it took was a lawsuit alleging its religious freedom had been violated. And it was. Ratio Christi sued the public university, alleging they were not allowed recognition as a campus organization based on its top members' expression and religious beliefs because the group requires its leaders to share and personally hold Christian beliefs. Makes sense. After settling with the university, the club is recognized, and the university must pay $20,500 of the group's legal fees. Amen.
So it took a lawsuit in a court to convince a university to allow Christian groups to elect Christian leadership.
Moving on to porn, or the lack thereof, at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., one student led a charge against porn on campus internet, garnering about 400 signatures on a petition calling for a porn ban. Joseph Ensler, a senior and international business major, then approached the student government, which recently passed a resolution calling on the school to prohibit access to the top 200 pornography websites through the campus network. University President John Garvey then said he'd be happy to block the websites from the wireless network. So, no porn, no more.
Wonder who's got the job of combing through and deciding what the top 200 are.
And finally, something much more appetizing. Students in Elkhart schools in Indiana will not go hungry. Students at the school are given breakfast and lunch, but according to the district, some go hungry on the weekends at home. The schools are partnering with a local nonprofit called Cultivate to provide weekend meals through the use of unused food that is left over from catering companies and large food service businesses. About 20 students are given a backpack with 8 individualized frozen meals. They're hoping the program expands to other schools in the near future. Now that, my friends, is resourcefulness.
So pay attention, Mom and Dad. Not only is the school responsible for teaching your kids every aspect of sex, socializing them and turning them into good progressive voters, but now we know that the schools are feeding your kids hot lunches, breakfasts, and dinners 5 days a week, and then when the weekend comes, they're taking backpacks of food home so they eat all weekend long. What exactly is the purpose of parents anymore?
And that's your extra credit for the week. Now, if you have any stories you'd like to suggest, go ahead, type them below in the comments section, and then make sure you hit that like button and share this episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the Dr. Duke Show audio podcast on iTunes, and please, please leave us that precious 5-star review and maybe, a nice comment or two.
And that does it for us this week on The Dr. Duke Show. If you like what you heard, please share the video and the podcast with your friends. 100,000 strong. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and take a minute to remember those that our students aren't learning about anymore. Let's remember those who have sacrificed for our incredible way of life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.